All right, welcome back, everyone. I'm David Kramer, again with the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs here at Florida International University. I'm in Miami, and I want to welcome you back to the State of the World 2021 conference that we're partnering with the McCain Institute, part of Arizona State University. And we are now turning to our next panel, which is entitled Great Power Competition. And to moderate it is an old dear friend of mine, Simon Marks, who is president and CEO of and chief correspondent of Feature Story News, which is based in Washington, but has offices and bureaus around the world, from New York to LA to Berlin, Moscow, and you name it. Simon's American Week, which appears on LBC Radio in the UK, is a must hear, and he shares that with me every week. I really recommend it. So Simon, it is over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, David. Thanks for that warm introduction. It's fantastic always to see you. And I'm hugely grateful to the invitation from FIU and the Green School and the McCain Institute for the invitation to host this panel at an absolutely extraordinary moment. I mean, when David and I first discussed this several months ago, we had no idea of the crisis point that was approaching in American democracy, much less the consequences that it is going to have going forward. And I noticed this morning that Susan Glasser, who hosted her panel, which was terrific, said she always enjoyed realizing that hers was not the most pessimistic voice at any event in which she was involved. I'm going to see if I can emulate that over the next 75 minutes. I'm slightly worried that I won't be able to, but let's see. We've got another cracking set of speakers for you here this afternoon, bringing decades of experience to our conversation about the great power competition that is underway. Ambassador Eric Eggleman at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University, former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, a former US ambassador to Turkey and Finland, and he's now the Roger Hertog Distinguished Practitioner in Residence at the Philip Merrill Center for Strategic Studies. Fiona Hill is the Robert Bosch Senior Fellow in the Center on the United States and Europe in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. She was Deputy Assistant to President Trump and Senior Director for European and Russian Affairs on the National Security Council from 2017 to 2019. I've been lucky enough to know Fiona for a very long time, so I'm delighted she's here. Delighted too that we're joined by Dr. Minchin Pei of Claremont McKenna College. For reporters like me, he has for a very long time been a go-to source when we want thoughts about China's rise and its relationship with the United States. He's the Tom and Margot Pritzker Professor of Government at Claremont McKenna. We're thrilled he's here and thrilled that Christopher Walker joins us from the National Endowment for Democracy, a key player in the endowment's International Forum for Democratic Studies and former Vice President for Strategy and Analysis at Freedom House, which I see only today, weighed in on the crisis in Myanmar. And I'm sure we're going to be discussing that later during the course of our conversation. I want to thank all four of them for being here and remind everyone watching that we will be taking your questions later. So please put those into the chat on Zoom as soon as you think of them, and we'll get to those a little bit later on during the course of this panel. But I wanted to start with a bit of a panoramic question. Michael Carpenter said this morning during Susan's panel that even the phrase great power competition is, as he put it, now too skinny a concept. That instead of thinking about all of this as a jostling back and forth between the US, China, and Russia, jostling one another for influence, it's really now a battle of two systems of governance: democracy on the American hand versus authoritarian oligarchic kleptocracies, which is how he characterized Russia, China, Iran, and others. To kick it off, Eric Edelman, if I can start with you. At this point, America comes to that table not exactly the shining city on the hill that it once claimed to be. I mean, this country not even a month ago was right on the edge of the abyss. So to what extent has its standing in that great power competition been seriously damaged, not just by the events of the last month, but also by the fact that all of the country's partners, interlocutors, and adversaries know that fully 74 million people just voted for a very dark, bleak, different approach to life here?
Well, Simon, first, thank you very much for the introduction, and to David and his colleagues at the Green School at FIU and the McCain Institute. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be on this panel with a longtime former colleague in government and friend, Fiona Hill, and Min Chin Pei, from whom I've learned so much about China. And I'm very grateful for his two recent books, really, on China's trapped transition and on crony capitalism in China, which I think inform very much the question, Simon, that you just asked, and to Chris for his work, both at NED and at Freedom House, two important institutions in the arsenal of the United States for pushing for greater democracy. Look, there's no question that what happened in the Capitol on January 6th was a huge black eye for the United States. Fiona has written, I think, very persuasively that this was a kind of abortive attempt at a coup, and certainly at blocking a normal, orderly transition of government, which we've had continuously since 1789, with one tragic exception in the United States in 1861. So it's definitely a huge issue. And from my perspective, as someone on the center-right side of the spectrum, I very much agree with Michael Carpenter's view that we are increasingly seeing a world that is divided along lines of democratic and authoritarian government. But what differentiates this period from, say, the Cold War, the post-World War II period, when the major challenge to democracy came from the left and from a global movement headquartered in Moscow, with communist parties beholden to Moscow around the world doing its bidding for the most part until late in the Cold War. We now face a circumstance in which the biggest challenge to democracy globally comes from the populist authoritarian right. We see that in Europe, certainly, in Central and Eastern Europe. We see it in France. We see it in Italy. We see it in Asia as well. We see it in the Philippines, for instance. And our great power adversaries, both Russia and China, are all too willing to take advantage both of those movements and our own divisions here at home to discredit the United States and to disable us from competing with them, and particularly from competing with them in the area of information operations and what I would basically call political warfare, which is being waged against us every day. I mean, I co-chaired a commission 2.5 years ago to review the national defense strategy that pointed out in the area of information and politics, we're not just in competition with Russia and China, we're actually in conflict with them every day, given what we see happening with things like solar winds and wolf warrior diplomacy, et cetera. So I think since the major challenge comes from the right, which is, I think, a little bit unusual for all of us who grew up in this Cold War period, it puts a special burden on those on the center right to call out the extremists on the right, as liberal anti-communists did very heroically during the Cold War, which helped contribute to the triumph of the West in the Cold War. And that, I think, unfortunately, is not happening as much as I would like to see it. There are some notable exceptions, including Mitt Romney and Liz Cheney quite prominently. But we need more. And unfortunately, on the conservative side of the House, there is no figure like William F. Buckley who is able to call out and excommunicate the Birchers and Ku Klux Klan as he did in the 60s, and today's variant of that, which is the QAnon crazies and extreme right-wing white supremacist nationalists who are unfortunately in the process of dominating the Republican Party.
So am I already not necessarily the most pessimistic man on the panel?
You said you were going to try to be less pessimistic than Susan. You didn't say I had to be.
Fiona Hill, let me ask you, Joe Biden says to the rest of the world, America is back. That's a pretty challenging claim to make. Madeleine Albright told this conference yesterday that America couldn't really be back unless and until it successfully cleaned its own stable. What's your view on whether the rest of the world is ready to believe that claim that America's truly back at the table to stay?
Well, I agree with Secretary Albright. If the United States doesn't show that it's able to really rein in many of the forces that Eric has just laid out, and be able to restore some coherence to its government, then the rest of the world will not believe that America is back. I mean, America over time, certainly for most of the decades of the 20th century, led by example. And that example was rooted in the effectiveness of its government, not just in its system of governance. I think this is part of the problem that we're grappling with right now. These competing systems are basically telling their populations that they can deliver. And this isn't just in the foreign policy arena, of course, it's domestically at home. And I think that's going to be the biggest challenge for President Biden. He's basically acknowledging, and he did so very clearly in his inauguration speech, that the divisions that have developed in the United States, they're pulling the country to the extremes on both left and right, as Eric has laid out, are really rooted in socioeconomic divisions, not just in cultural or identity divisions, racial or religious, but very much in the sense that the country is split between people who have a great deal, the billionaires at the very top, and the rest of everybody else who are struggling. And of course, the pandemic has put that into an extraordinarily harsh light. We have inequality in the United States now that the last time we saw these kinds of levels of deprivation were during the Great Recession of the 1920s and 1930s. And the pandemic has, as I've said, exacerbated all of this. We've got a long way to go still to get out of this. But what Joe Biden is going to have to show that democracy, that the United States version of democracy can actually deliver to people who are suffering. It can get the pandemic in check. It can carry out mass vaccinations, and it can start to address some of the socioeconomic problems. And really what we're contending with is China in particular, and I'm sure that Min Pei will have something to say about this, actually saying, well, no, authoritarian systems like China can deliver better. We've already tackled the pandemic. We're already dealing with poverty. We've, over the last several decades, eliminated millions of, or lifted up rather, millions of people out of poverty. Of course, we can, question a lot about this. But I think, the one place where it might be faltering, and, perhaps we'll get to this later on, is actually Russia itself, because we're seeing, against the backdrop of our discussions today, mass protests in Russia, which are really also rooted in that idea of democracy delivering or authoritarianism delivering, and the fact that many people are hurting, not just because of COVID, but also because of growing disparities and inequalities in their societies. So it's a complicated picture. But if Joe Biden can show that he can deliver on a number of fronts, then America will be back. It'll be in that leadership position again, and showing that a democratic system can actually satisfy some of the demands of its population internally. And
just picking up on the Russia thing, Fiona, we should mention that while everyone was at lunch, we got the news that Alexei Navalny has been sentenced to more than 2 years in jail in Moscow. We will absolutely get to that a little bit later in the panel. But I do want to bring in Min Pei there. I mean, there's been so much in the news just in the last few days that in many ways has provided useful fodder for this conversation. And I'm thinking specifically about China in the context of Myanmar. President Biden, in his statement yesterday on Myanmar, said, "The United States is taking note of those who stand with the people of Burma in this difficult hour." I mean, it was almost redolent of Nikki Haley, who used to say at the United Nations, "We're taking names." I mean, Min Shin-pei, with regard to that kind of a statement this early in the Biden administration, does that cause any sleepless nights in Beijing? And how are they bracing themselves to deal with the next chapter of this great power struggle?
I think in the case of Burma, China probably does not get really worried about what Biden has just said. I think the US has very limited leverage. China actually has a strong interest in stability. I'm not saying that China has a strong interest in democracy in Burma. I think what China is much more worried is about Biden's ability to get the US domestic situation addressed effectively, and then whether Biden can actually form a broad-based international alliance of democracies. China plays a long game. I think of all the adversaries the US faces today, China actually has probably formulated a strategy that looks ahead 30 years out. Not just Chinese, the Chinese elites have realized that they've either stumbled into or they've got on their hands a situation which is reminiscent of the last Cold War. It's not exactly the Cold War. So this is the first point I want to make. The other thing, I want to be a little bit more optimistic about democracy. When we look at the whole democratic world, the US stands out because we put so much hope on the US. The US indeed is in a very, very difficult spot. Democracy probably faces more near-term challenges in the US than in Europe. But on the whole, when we look at authoritarian regimes, from Russia to China, from and those in the Middle East, they face some really serious structural weaknesses. And behind the bravado actually is a deep sense of insecurity. When you look at statements coming out of Beijing, basically Xi Jinping and his colleagues are saying that you guys leave us alone. We just want to maintain our authoritarian system as it is at home. Even though their influence globally is expanding, what is very different about this round of authoritarian resurgence, whatever you call it, it's not their confidence in their ideology. They don't really have an ideology. And I really want to echo what Eric has just said. The danger today is really right-wing. The Chinese regime and the Russian regime are very right-wing regimes. They're not, if Chairman Mao can come back, Chairman Mao will be the first one to lead a revolution against the current Chinese Communist Party. Because this is, when you look at the social policy, it's really very, very right-wing. So I think we need to be quite confident in democracy's ability to recover. And when we look at the US, I think what happened January 6th was very disturbing. But we need to look at what happened on November 3rd. And that was an affirmation of the resilience of democracy. So that's, I think, where I want to end for now. But basically, I'm still very optimistic about the long-term prospects of democracy. That's because it has, besides competence of government, it still has some very appealing intrinsic values that the majority of the people around the world will rally to.
Christopher Walker, I'm sure you would agree that it has very appealing intrinsic values. You spend a lot of your time, all your time, thinking about democracy and advancing its cause. But how do you see the US situation currently as it relates to the great game of power competition?
So thanks, Simon, and thanks to David Kramer and the organizers for the invitation today. I think I'd answer your question by putting the last 15 years into context and into how that shaped the strategic landscape today. So if we look back 15 years ago to what was the onset of what Larry Diamond calls the Democratic Recession, it's now fully half of the 30 years since the end of the Cold War where we've been in a democratic downturn. This was something that wasn't anticipated. It wasn't the conventional wisdom coming out of the 1990s. And I think it's caused us today to stretch our imaginations a bit about how we grapple with some of the issues we face. I think it's also terribly important for all of us to recall that it was around the mid-2000s when the tech revolution took off in earnest. This is when Facebook launched. It was when YouTube launched. That was in 2005. Google launched in 1996, but in 1999, but it really took off during the 2000s. And Twitter was launched in 2006. I think with hindsight, we can see that the confluence of a whole host of tech revolution events, the launch of social media, and this political turbulence were running in parallel. It's also worth noting that the global financial crisis hit in 2008, which among other things helped to, I think, accelerate and deepen the difficulties in the information space, both in the way democracies process information and ordinary citizens grapple with the world around them. But it also afforded, I think, many authoritarian regimes unanticipated opportunities to start to use surveillance and information manipulation in ways even they didn't anticipate, starting from that point. And so these were very significant factors of disruption that started feeding into the landscape. So let's fast forward to where we are today. Surely the large authoritarian powers have started to flex their military muscles. We see this with China and the South China Sea. We see it in the case of India in certain respects. Russia has done this in Ukraine, but also in Syria. But I'm not sure that's really the bigger story. I think the bigger story is the way in which these large, globally ambitious authoritarian regimes have started to exert their influence in domains where democracies thought they would have the advantage. Talking about the media domains, the knowledge economy, including universities, publishers, corrupt capital, strategic corruption. I don't think many really anticipated the way in which these regimes, first and foremost China and their surrogates, but Russia as well, have leveraged economic intercourse as a way of manipulating politics and otherwise corroding democratic institutions in established democracies and young, hopeful democracies alike. And finally, of course, the tech realm, where I think the extent of the intersection between these autocratic regimes and democratic regimes was not fully appreciated going back certainly a decade and a half. Today, we're in the midst of something that's quite profound. And I think it's fair to say that democracies are playing catch up. And so I would conclude these thoughts by saying the competitive landscape is not what we anticipated. And I agree with this idea that we can't look at this in a bipolar or simply a bifurcated way, but there are actually many more strands and tentacles in the competitive landscape today that we're wrestling with, that leading democracies, including but not limited to the United States, need to think about fresh ways of responding to.
And Eric Eggleman, that does bring us back to the point, one of the points that you were making at the start. I mean, there is clearly a need to try and overcome a situation in which millions of Americans continue at the moment to embrace QAnon conspiracy theories. They're not buying the Joe Biden promise of truth over lies. They're actually still siding with lies over truth. And while Madeleine Albright was perfectly justifiably talking about the need to clean up the stable is not, unfortunately, in stasis. I mean, you can be cleaning it up even as foreign actors, state actors, are continuing to sully it with yet more ongoing misinformation. How critical is it going to be? I mean, there was talk this morning of Joe Biden's proposed summit of democracies. I mean, if you do that, one of the goals must surely be to determine how you can successfully find a way of cleaning up your own backyard while others are continuing to try and pollute it.
Well, I think that's right, Simon. I mean, as I said in my opening remarks, I mean, I think we need to go back in time a bit and think about this in the kinds of terms that would have been familiar to George Kennan and President Eisenhower in the late 40s and 50s, which is this is really a form of political warfare that's being waged against us. And to Chris's point, tech platforms that have been pioneered here in the United States are being instrumentalized by our adversaries against us and used against us every day. I had the privilege actually of co-chairing a task force that German Marshall Fund and AEI sponsored on with Avril Haines about making democracies more resilient against our authoritarian adversaries. And some of this has got to do with issues that transcend those that we normally in the foreign affairs realm deal with, including education, secondary and tertiary education in the United States, civic education, giving people the tools to be able to understand information and how it's being used, weaponized against the United States and against its interests and against our democracy. Some of that's defensive, but frankly, there's also an offensive side to this. And it's one where our authoritarian adversaries have a vulnerability. And we can see that playing out today. Fiona was talking about Russia, and you mentioned Navalny's 3.5-year sentence. Our adversaries are corrupt. They are kleptocracies. Minchin's written about some of this in the Chinese case. We need to be, I think, more willing to go on the offense and highlight for their domestic audiences the corruption of our adversaries. And I think that includes going after Vladimir Putin personally and his ill-gotten wealth. Look how powerful a tool that was in the hands of Navalny and his recent video about Rotenberg's palace.
Fiona, let's talk about Navalny. As Eric mentioned, we got news of that jail sentence during the lunch break here. Even before that, the case of Alexei Navalny was going to serve as a litmus test, not just for Joe Biden, but for Vladimir Putin as well. I was struck this morning that Michael Carpenter in the earlier panel was talking about the US neuralgically, as he put it, reaching for sanctions every time there's an irritant in the relationship with Moscow, whereas he was arguing the best way to punish Vladimir Putin for the treatment of Navalny is to persuade Angela Merkel to drop Nord Stream 2. I am assuming, Fiona, that you tried that and didn't necessarily view the use of sanctions as being entirely neuralgic.
Well, it was a bit of, a number of things here, actually. I have to say that I do quite agree with Mike that we do have perhaps a knee-jerk and often neuralgic tendency to reach for sanctions. But it's partly because, they have been in many respects proven to work in the sense of imposing pain on the target on the other end of the sanctions. They're not always, however, proven to work in terms of getting the response that you always want. Because though you've inflicted pain, you often find that the country on the receiving end, it doesn't really want to change what they're doing because it works for them. So they just try to find ways of either avoiding the sanctions or doing something differently next time so that it's more difficult to hit them. So, we do have to think about other ways that we can tackle these issues that are not always sanctions. So I think Mike was, very right on that. In terms of Nord Stream 2, the way that was, unfortunately approached under the Trump administration was more punitive of Germany than it was of Russia. So if we could actually get the Germans themselves and the Europeans to take action, of their own volition, that would also be an important element. But what we have learned in dealing with Russia is things actually work when you work in unison with all of your allies. So whatever we decide to do has always got to be in close coordination and consultation with our allies. That gets Russia's attention. But, one of the things that we could do most effectively at all is what I sometimes call sanctioning ourselves, cleaning up our own act. Because both Minchin and Eric, and also Chris in the work that the National Endowment for Democracy does, always points out how much a kleptocracy undermines democracy. We were heading in that direction ourselves. We've got plenty of crony capitalism. The United States, frankly, has been a venue for money laundering. I mean, we have places in the United States, no offense to everybody in Florida, but Miami, also Joe Biden's state of Delaware, New York, I mean, you name it. There are many havens for shady money from, as they say, shady places. And the Russians have certainly been investing very heavily in real estate and all kinds of other ventures here in the United States. And they've also been trying to corrupt the democratic process, political process, gain influence through proxies here in Europe as well as at home. So what we could certainly do is push through legislation in the Congress that would make it much more difficult for them to do that. So the kind of anti-kleptocracy initiatives and bills that people like Senator Sheldon Whitehouse and other bipartisan groups have been pushing, that would also get the attention because it would be much more difficult for them to get influence overseas. And then, of course, it might also put some pressure at home, because what we see in all of these kleptocracies, including in Russia, and this is what, of course, Alexei Navalny was trying to spotlight, is a lot of the Russian oligarchs and people like Putin as well put money somewhere else. They don't keep it all, even in palaces in Moscow or by the Black Sea. They're trying to actually stash it away somewhere else where they can take advantage of property rights and private, security outside of Russia.
And Fiona, can I ask?
Could I just
please go ahead.
I just like to add one thing to what Fiona said. I mean, I agree with everything she said. I do think one notable step was taken with the National Defense Authorization Act this year, which included a provision outlawing anonymized limited liability companies. It's an interesting question. A lot of people wondered, why President Trump vetoed the bill and had it passed over his veto. And given everything that's happened in January, it's understandable that people would pass over that. But I think, in fact, it's very likely he vetoed the bill, not because of Confederate base renaming or some of the other issues that he cited, but in fact, because of that provision. I think it's an important first step, but as Fiona says, there's a lot more that we need to do here at home.
Fiona, can I just ask you about one element of the US-Russia relationship that is sort of classically great power competition, and that's the agreement that was seemingly struck between Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin in their first telephone conversation to extend New START for 5 years, the last remaining nuclear arms control agreement between the United States and Russia. How should we all be reading that? Is that an indication that a progressive relationship is possible between Washington and Moscow, or were there other elements to that conversation?
Well, there are lots of other elements to the conversation, as you obviously are well aware, Simon, and I'm sure everyone else is as well. I mean, obviously, arms control and the bilateral fixation on the old superpower legacy from the Cold War has been the staple of US-Russian relations in the last several decades. And it's always been one area where the Russians clearly want to sit down at the table to thrash things out with the United States. And we did get bogged down in the last 4 years by, really the kind of old 1980s mindset of approaching this, that it just had to be Russia and the United States, when now, of course, the world is a much more complex place. You've got North Korea and Iran who've tried to approach nuclear blackmail. North Korea, certainly of the United States and of other major powers, Iran of its regional neighbors, and Israel in its pursuit of a nuclear weapon. You've also got India, Pakistan, a whole range of other countries that now have nuclear weapons, and of course China, which is very prominent on the intermediate nuclear force range, but is not quite obviously at the same level as the United States and Russia when it comes to strategic nuclear weapons. So it's a much more difficult environment than it was previously. So even if we settle with Russia on the extension of New START for 5 years, we still haven't settled on the overall complexity of the nuclear space. And as Russia is one of the permanent 5 nuclear powers at the UN, Russia itself should be very mindful about proliferation risks and about this complexity. And there was one thing that the Trump administration was trying to do, was try to engage Russia and China simultaneously in discussions. Obviously that didn't go too well. The Chinese weren't particularly interested, but there's still a lot of an agenda for the 21st century that needs to be worked out in arms control. So this doesn't really settle things. It puts a kind of a period, or maybe even just a comma at the end of the last several decades of discussions by extending this. But we have other areas where Russia is really trying to play hardball, and cyber is one of those. That gets back to Chris and Minxin, and I mean Eric has touched upon this, the whole new arena of strategic competition, the platforms that other adversaries are trying to use. And we've seen the Russians not just by hacking the election, the efforts of interference in 2016, but this huge hack on US government systems that was taking place against the backdrop of the 2020 election. The Russians are basically saying, we also want to be a cyber superpower. We want to be at that table as well. So this is the arena that we're going to have to also factor in to the nuclear discussions about strategic stability, because the command and control and the security of our nuclear systems are also affected by cyber. So this is a really big issue. Yes, we can start to talk about the Russians, but we haven't to fool ourselves into thinking that we can easily settle some of these questions. It's a much more complicated environment than we were in when Gorbachev and Reagan were sitting down at summits.
Minxin Pei, can you pick up on that and address whether China, from your perspective, has any intention at any point in the short term of engaging in essentially a kind of a tripartite conversation about arms control with the United States and Russia, or is that completely dead from Beijing's perspective?
The quick answer is no, China has no interest, at least for now. For very obvious reasons. China has a much smaller nuclear arsenal. At some point, I think, depending on how big China's nuclear arsenal grows, at some point, there will have to be an arms control agreement involving China, Russia, and possibly India. So I think the future of arms control, and here Eric is a real specialist, will involve a lot more players, and that will make it quite complicated. Looking ahead, because we're talking about great power competition, I'm really worried about a new round of arms race. This is a very unstable situation. During the last Cold War, the two superpowers tried to rein in their arms race toward the end of the conflict. Now we need to learn the lesson. We need to start doing this at the beginning of this conflict, set some ground rules so that we don't go off the rails in terms of trying to gain some strategic or military edge over the other. So this is an area I think we should pay a lot more attention to than we're doing right now. Because at the moment, there's really no strategic stability among the big players in this new great power competition.
And Minxin, can I ask you about another aspect of the relationship with China? John Kerry was suggesting last week at the White House that it might be possible to think about decompartmentalizing the conversation about climate change with China from all the other issues that dominate the agenda. How will the Chinese view that? Will they view that as potentially an interesting idea, or will they say to themselves, this climate change issue is much more important for the Biden administration than it was for its predecessors? There's a real opportunity to drive some leverage there.
Yeah, I think China has interest in leveraging the climate change issue. China believes, as you just said, that Biden places a lot more value on this than China does. But at the same time, they don't know how. That is, it's tricky. How do you link an issue that a lot of other countries care about? And if you become very obstructionist, you lose a lot of political capital or moral capital with other countries. So it's still something they try to work out. I think it will be smart for them to tell the Biden administration that because there's a lot of so-called technological decoupling going on, let's try to control technological decoupling. If it's climate technology related, let's try to cooperate. I think where China can conceivably play a constructive role is to get more countries behind ambitious goals of carbon neutrality. and then spell out its own program. Because right now, China has declared a very ambitious goal. It does not have detailed maps to get there. And I think the Biden administration need to press China on the details. At the same time, American allies need to get to the Chinese leaders and say, well, if you want to use climate as a leverage, then forget about it, because you're going to pay a huge price for it.
I want to remind everybody we're going to be getting into questions from the audience, so please populate that Zoom chat with questions, and we'll be getting to those fairly soon. They can be about any aspect of great power competition. Chris Walker, I want to talk to you about information warfare, which is another aspect of great power contest that we've heard Eric talking about earlier, and the need really to use it more effectively. We've just been through a number of weeks here in Washington where VOA and its mission have narrowly escaped, I think, their own date with the abyss. You still have a situation here in Washington where RT has a massive studio complex of its own and scores of people generating propaganda broadcasting from the heart of the US Capitol. There's no opportunity for VOA to do anything approximating the same in Moscow, for example. What should the United States be doing now when it comes to the information warfare battle?
Thank you for the question, Simon. I think one of the things that is so striking in this conversation is how wide-ranging the challenges in these domains we're discussing. So Fiona Hill just alluded to this massive hack that is believed to have been perpetrated by the Russian authorities on the United States. And when we take a step back, we see that that issue and the issue you've just raised with me are part of this larger puzzle, which is impacting not only the United States, but really all open societies. And so today, there's a massive investment. The Russian authorities don't invest in schools and hospitals in the Russian Federation, but they do invest in disinformation and hacking beyond their borders. That's what they privilege, that's what they emphasize. And of course, they invest in their security services, which are beating the heads of students and others on the streets of Moscow and St. Petersburg and other cities throughout Russia. I think what we see today, and I'll go back to my original comments, is that from the vantage point of the mid-2000s, which by the way, is when RT was launched. So that was a part of the package of both technological revolution, but also the fast tracking of authoritarian outward-facing communications platforms. The Chinese started that a little bit earlier, but nevertheless really caught their momentum following that. I think it's essential for us to remember that the democracies cannot hit a pause button and wait for the authoritarians to stop. They won't stop. They're competing now full bore in all these domains. And I make one final observation on this count. I think in the same way that ordinary Russians suffer under propaganda and information manipulation, this now is being shared with the wider world, including North America, Western Europe, Southeastern Europe, Latin America, and increasingly Africa, in ways that is detrimental to free expression. And this is something I think we can use as an opportunity for us to recognize that we're in this battle together. Finally, just coming back to one last point, if you'll bear with me, I think what Alexei Navalny is doing now is reaffirming democratic values. He is fighting for a norm against corruption that also is impacting us. The export of kleptocracy now comes into rule of law countries from rule by law settings. And I think to the extent we don't defend ourselves, we are opening the door to these kleptocrats. But when we defend ourselves, we help the natural allies that are fighting for democracy and freedom in their own societies. And I think this is where we are today. We have to recognize that we're in this together.
Eric, is the United States, though, willing to close loopholes that exist where some of these foreign actors are absolutely taking advantage of America's constitutionally guaranteed freedoms in a very similar way to the manner in which the Al-Qaeda terrorists back in September the 11th, 2001, took advantage of America's structural freedoms. I mean, is there a willingness, do you think, on the part of the United States and other democracies to take actions against, for example, a broadcaster like RT that on the face of it fly in the face of America's First Amendment protections?
Well, it's Simon, it's a complicated question because there's no doubt that there are First Amendment issues here that have to be, protected. But, First Amendment rights extend to individuals and not to robots, not to artificially created bots that are run by the, Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, for instance. And so I think it's not outside the ability of Americans to be able to police some of this. Some of it's going to require more effort on the part of the tech companies themselves, who've been very reluctant to deal with some of these issues. But I don't think it's outside the ken of men and women in the U.S. Congress, for instance, who want to try and tackle some of these problems to be able to come up with bipartisan solutions to them if there's the will. I do want to pick up on something that Chris said, though. He's absolutely right that our adversaries are weaponizing corruption against us and against the United States. And some colleagues and I actually wrote an article about the rise of strategic corruption in foreign affairs this past summer. And I'll offer one very, very good example, which was the effort by, which I know a little bit about from my misspent youth, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's persistent efforts in the Trump administration to get the Justice Department to drop the case against Halk Bank, a state-owned Turkish bank that was up to its eyeballs in efforts to evade U.S. sanctions on Iran. It was a very near-run thing. I mean, they almost pulled it off because I think had President Trump had his way and had not various actors at different times, Secretary Tillerson, and Attorney General Barr and others stopped it, I think there's a chance that the prosecution against Halk Bank would have been dropped. And so I quite agree with Chris. We've got to defend ourselves against these efforts to export corruption to the United States. And in doing so, I think that will actually also weaken some of our authoritarian adversaries and even some of our authoritarian allies who are reaching in and trying to take advantage of the loopholes, as you say, that we have in our system.
And you've mentioned Turkey, Eric. I wanted to obviously ask you about your thoughts about President Erdogan in terms of the great power competition, specifically relating to his decision to go ahead with the purchase of the S-400s, incurring American sanctions, further complicating his relationship with NATO and obviously the European Union. But I mean, in the great power competition, was that not President Erdogan making his choice, and his choice wasn't an American one?
Well, I think it's a complicated issue, and it's, I think, even more getting more complicated by the day. Well, certainly, let me start by saying prima facie for a NATO ally to purchase a Russian air and missile defense system that's incompatible with NATO systems and incompatible with danger. It's not even incompatible. It presents a potential danger to the advanced F-35 fighter, which Turkey was going to be purchasing from the United States and was a partner in developing, is obviously a huge problem. I would say this, though. President Erdogan, if you look at how he's played his hand, is actually on the opposite side of Russia in any number of places. In the Caucasus, in the recent fight between Azerbaijan and Armenia over Nagorno-Karabakh, in Ukraine, in Libya, in Syria, President Erdogan and Turkey find themselves, as they have been typically historically, on the other side of Russia from these conflicts. Nonetheless, he has managed to maintain, he's been able to keep those things in bounds and maintained a fairly cordial relationship with President Putin. Some of that is related to the S-400 purchase. And who ends up, I mean, literally who ends up benefiting from that, I mean, profiting from that. Recently, President Erdogan had a phone call with President Putin in which he raised the prospect of buying yet another battery of S-400 air and missile defense missiles. My belief is he was signaling to the Biden administration, of which he is a bit fearful, that he has another option. So don't threaten me with more sanctions. I mean, the catch of sanctions were only imposed in December after about a 2-year wait, during which President Trump essentially shielded Erdogan from the consequences of his actions and from the consequences of the anger of many of those in Congress who wanted to sanction Turkey. In the end of the day, we have to, though, as Fiona says, have a policy that's about more than sanctions. And so I think we have to have a very broad-ranging discussion with Erdogan and with the Turks about exactly where they think they fit in the world, and how we can work together where our interests clearly align, but drawing some lines beyond which we cannot allow them to go, including things like purchasing S-400.
Fiona, can I go back to an issue that you mentioned right at the beginning? And that is vaccines and vaccine distribution and the COVID-19 crisis. We see various countries now engaged in vaccine diplomacy. There's certainly enormous pressure from those countries that have not yet received vaccines, many of them, of course, in the developing world, to acquire vaccines from the developed world. I mean, I don't think a year ago, or maybe 53, 54 weeks ago, any of us expected vaccine distribution in the midst of a pandemic to be part and parcel of a great power competition. But it is right now, isn't it?
It is. And this is incredibly unfortunate because look, even at the height of the Cold War, we could do better than this. And I think we need to get into our mindset that this is polio, smallpox, tuberculosis, any of the great scourges of the past of mankind where we've pulled together. I mean, there's been part of it has to be said is the blame on people like President Trump and others who have downplayed the disease. He's not the only one, of course. There's been plenty around the world who've done this. Bolsonaro, the president of Mexico, who's actually got it right now. Clearly the Chinese government tried to deflect a lot of attention away from, the origins of the pandemic in the first instance. But we've got to get our act together. This is an enormous threat to mankind. And it's not just a question of the high levels of deaths. I mean, the tragedy of the human losses. It's the impact this is going to have on everyone's systems. We're talking about all of these issues of great power competition, still in a kind of a mindset of pre-January 2020. And I think that this pandemic, just personally, as a historian and many other people listening to this as well, looking back to the great plagues of the past, not just the great influenza of 1918, have got to realize about what a world-changing event this is. When you look back to the Black Death across Europe, it decimated parts of the population and had massive political change in its wake, not just socioeconomic change. This is going to have the same thing because we're also seeing millions of people who are going to be impaired by their experience of having this virus. So this is going to have long-term lingering effects. We're already talking about, perhaps the greatest recession since the 20s and 30s, already compounding some of the problems I began with of this massive inequality in societies. I also don't think that China is going to come out of this, quite as rosy and robust as, perhaps people are suggesting. So I think here we've got to get our act together and we need a global approach. And, I just like to use this as a kind of one of these public announcement broadcasts, Simon, that you and I grew up with in the United Kingdom. Could we not just have a global vaccine effort? Could we not help the Russians improve Sputnik? Could we not help China improve their vaccine? Because we need to vaccinate billions of people. So playing games of whether this vaccine's better or that vaccine's better is not at all helpful. And if we don't basically get vaccinated, the poorest, most impoverished people in places like a Somalia or a Bangladesh, this disease is going to keep on going and lay waste to the entire planet for another cycle. So I know I'm sounding a little preachy here, but I mean, the whole idea of vaccine nationalism is absurd, self-defeating and deadly.
Min Pei, from a Chinese perspective, China has engaged so much of its time, its effort, and its money in building relationships with Africa and African nations that outstrip the relationships any other country has managed to create. What do they do about vaccines and Africa? Because all of that has the potential to be at risk, right? Depending on how China and other players in this great power game go about approaching the distribution of vaccines in Africa.
China faces two challenges in Africa. The short term is really the vaccine. China has now sort of approved one vaccine and is working on another one. China has two effective vaccines, but they're quite mediocre in terms of. The problem China faces is that China has promised more than any other country, except I think the AstraZeneca, the Oxford vaccine. China is supplying more. China's problem is that for reasons I still don't understand, that China's production capacity is quite limited. China cannot produce enough vaccines to vaccinate the people at home and also export sufficient quantities to Africa. So I think this is really a big test for China, whether it can do what other Western countries apparently have not been able to do. The other longer term issue you've not mentioned, which is Belton Road. This is a big boondoggle for China, and China needs to wind it down because it has left a lot of African countries deeply indebted with half-finished projects. And how will China actually deal with that issue? So going forward, China has some very serious cleaning up work to do in Africa.
Okay, well, I'm going to go for the last 15 minutes or so to questions that have been stacking up in the question box. Very, very happy to take more of them. So please keep adding them as we go along. And I want to start with one from Max Uloa, I hope I pronounced that correctly, who's an FIU student who says, and I'm going to direct this one to you, Chris, to start. China and Russia continue to seek territorial gains, whether through direct annexation, land expansion, Crimea and the South China Sea, or veiled threats to places like Taiwan, and launch dangerous disinformation campaigns against the US and its allies. How can the US remain ahead of the curve in the great power conflict when it seems many American responses to these conflicts have focused on handling the aftermath of crises rather than effectively preventing these crises from occurring in the first place? How, in other words, does the United States get ahead of the curve rather than being often behind it?
It's a terrific question, and it captures so much of the challenge that we're confronting today, both on the military side, but I would say for what I focus on the non-military side. I think part of this can be seen as the democracies retaking the initiative in areas that should be their natural competitive advantage. And this would include defending free expression, free association more directly, just as a matter of principle. There are ways to do this. Also, I think, as other speakers have noted, to put a premium on working with our allies who share our values. I think when we look at the China challenge, where China is now putting billions and billions of dollars into their outward facing activities, including in the media sphere. Just today, we've released a report called China's Global Media Footprint, authored by Sarah Cook, which details this in an extraordinary way. I think what that tells us is we may not be able to meet all of these efforts dollar for dollar, both the efforts to seize territory militarily, but I would say as importantly, to impinge on the idea space and to take sovereignty in the non-kinetic context, which we're seeing in so many ways through technology. I think that requires more thinking, more forethought, and cooperation with allies that just hasn't been quite as visible in recent years, but really should be put front and center.
Thank you, Chris. We have a question from Danny Tarao, who is a senior graduating in April, well done, in international relations with a certificate in European and Eurasian studies. And Eric, maybe you could address this one. Given that Russia and especially China have strategic interests in vast arrays of areas and places, with that reality in mind, how can states in Europe and the United States manage a suitable and stable relationship going forward when containment remains the preferred policy of many in Washington?
Well, I'm not 100% sure I agree with the premise that containment is actually the preferred policy of many in Washington. I think it's I think the Washington debate's a little bit more complicated than that. Look, there's no question that China and Russia have legitimate interests in their neighborhoods, and I don't think that the United States has any desire not to recognize those interests. What I do think, though, is that we cannot allow either Russia or China to threaten their neighbors with the use of force in order to get their view of their interests vindicated, which is what we see China doing today in Hong Kong, to some degree with Australia, which has gone kind of unremarked. I mean, the kind of bullying of Australia by the PRC has, unfortunately been lost in all the noise of our presidential election campaign and the aftermath. And I think we need to do more on that front. And the same with Russia with regard to its neighbors like Ukraine, the Baltic states, Moldova, and others. It's one thing to have, legitimate interests. Those legitimate interests are not necessarily the same thing as recognizing that these countries are somehow subject to the suzerainty of either Moscow or Beijing. And that's something I think we have broad agreement on with our allies, both our multilateral allies in NATO and Europe, but also our bilateral treaty allies in East Asia, as well as other countries with whom we partner. And so I think we have, as several of my colleagues have said here, a strong basis on which to work with our allies. There's a lot of repair work that has to be done, in particular because of some of the attitudes that President Trump, but not just President Trump, to be fair, his predecessor as well, have had to our allies in terms of downgrading them, accusing them of not pulling their weight, et cetera. So I think, a wise course for the Biden administration will be to try and spend its early months in office doing the sort of hard work that my former boss, George Shultz, used to call gardening, which is, tending to our alliances and making our allies realize that we do have their back and we intend to support them and work with them cooperatively to deal with these common challenges, which is something they haven't really heard for, a number of years now.
But Eric, that's an important point, the one that you're making there about the fact that, this is not just a facet of the last 4 years. I mean, if we go back to the moment Barack Obama became president and there was this huge global sigh of relief because the George W. Bush era was over and America was back. And then America wasn't as much back as many parts of the world wanted it to be. You talk to ambassadors from the Asia Pacific region, they will tell you that the pivot to Asia was much more promised than delivered, and that we're in the middle here of a period of not just 4 years, but arguably of the best part of 20 years where the United States hasn't engaged in a lot of that gardening.
That's absolutely right. And I think it's one reason why I think, Secretary Albright is correct that it's not just going to be enough to announce that America's back, because we have to take care of, our own home, that's for sure. But it's also the case that just announcing that America's back, or as President Biden said before his inauguration in his interview with Lester Holt of NBC News, that we're going to be at the head table organizing the global response to things. I think our allies on this one are going to be from Missouri. They're going to want us to show them that we actually mean it, and we have to back it up. And we're going to have to show up. Woody Allen famously said 99% of life is just showing up. And for the last 4 or 5 years, the United States has just not been showing up at things like APEC or the ASEAN Regional Forum. And we're going to have to actually show up at a sufficiently high level. Luckily for the administration, given the amount of work there is to do, I think, because of COVID, there's a lot of this stuff that's going to go on virtually. And so it will save a little bit of wear and tear on the president and the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense's bodies, other senior administration officials, the National Security Advisor, but they're going to have to do a lot of it. They're going to have to do a lot of Zoom diplomacy and a lot of hard work on the phone with colleagues to make them understand that this is not just a rhetorical flourish, but it's something serious. And the other thing I think they're going to have to do, by the way, is defend the defense budget. Because for the United States to declare that it's back, while at the same time it is ruthlessly cutting its defense budget, will send a mixed signal to people about whether the United States is really back or not. And that's putting aside, what Fiona and others have said about, this is not just about military things. It's about a lot more than that. But in the end of the day, kind of the sine qua non of being at the head table is being the world's most powerful military. And if it looks like we're, dismantling that, that's going to undercut the message of leadership.
Fiona Hill, Teresa Schuster is an FIU student studying political science, and she's got an easy question for you. How do you envision, it's just gone off my screen. Hang on a second, let me find it again. How do you envision Russia's eventual future without Vladimir Putin? In this future, do you predict a move towards or away from democracy?
Great question. And of course, somewhat unanswerable. But, actually, I want to pick up and tie that together with something I was thinking about as Eric was talking, because it actually is the same issue in Russia as it is in the United States. When President Biden is saying America is back, and, Eric was just talking about America, the United States needs to show up at APEC and ASEAN. Well, President Trump appeared everywhere. He was always at summits. He was showing up at all of these events, but he was showing up as himself, as just, the president of, well, it wasn't even quite clear sometimes the president of himself. It was a hyper-personalized presidency. And we have to show that America is back by showing that America is back overall. We all have to be back together. FIU students, all of us who are citizens of the United States, who are agents in our own right and are representing the country. So Eric is absolutely right that it's going to have to be the entire government. And this is the problem in Russia. And it's just exactly in that question, because we can't think of Russia now without Vladimir Putin. And you might remember that, in fact, some of the people around Putin, about the last time that he was running for the president, basically said, there is no Russia without Putin, there is no Putin without Russia, but there's really just no Russia without Vladimir Putin. And I was just actually looking while we were speaking at the exact kind of time frame that Alexei Navalny has been sentenced to jail. That will very conveniently take us through to the next Russian presidential election, which, of course, Putin has put himself in the spotlight again as running for president, because he saw through the amendments to the Russian constitution that now allow him to run out to be president until 2036. So, Putin's trying to tell us that he could be there for not just one more presidential term, but another 2 presidential terms, by which he's going to be 80. This is well over 80. And this is actually what President Trump was trying to do. He was trying to push through the term limits I mean, of course, he was, entitled if he'd won the election to another term, but he was basically trying to say, I want to be here in perpetuity as well. So we're having, kind of a debate here about the future of Russia, but it's really just, as the question suggests, a debate about the future of Vladimir Putin. And Alexei Navalny's imprisonment shows that Putin is pretty scared, because there is no answer to that question inside of Russia, what Russia looks like without Vladimir Putin, because he's extinguished opposition. The Duma, the Russian parliament, doesn't really mean very much. And all that is of Russia now is not the people with their agency, the people who are protesting in support of Navalny, because this is what this is about. It's a showdown about the future of whether Russia is a country of 140 million Russians, or whether Russia is a country of just one guy and the kleptocracy and the clique around him. And that's only going to have to be resolved by Russians themselves. And it is possible to have democracy in Russia when, Chris and David and you and Simon and, many of us, were sort of starting out our careers, back in the 1990s, Russia was having a democratic experiment. It had it under the end of Gorbachev, just like, at various points, China sort of has, at least in the regions, not just at the center. And it was possible with full attention to the rule of law and to trying to have proper checks and balances to pull something off in Russia. But what we saw instead was crony capitalism, the cutting off of, the state, the privatization of the state, really reducing Russian democracy over the course of the 1990s and into the 2000s. So it's not impossible to have more of a democratic opening again in Russia, but it's really going to be determined by the Russian people themselves and how they now react to someone like Alexei Navalny, the only really promising opposition figure in the terms of being able to mobilize a movement behind him. And as obviously Putin is running scared. So the answer to that question is really about whether Putin succeeds in taking Navalny out of the picture and therefore the Russian people out of the picture. But that's what we've got to do here at home too. We've got to put ourselves in the picture, all 330 million Americans, for America to be back to. Great.
I've got 4 minutes left. I'm going to try and get 2 more questions in, one for Chris, but first one for Minchin. This comes from Nicole Hatton. She's an FIU senior, double majoring in international relations and political science. And her question is about Belton Road. What implications, if any, are there for future wars given increased Chinese military presence as a result of Belton Road in many regions? Minchin.
Yeah, I think the military applications of Belt and Road projects are quite limited. I would say probably in a place like Sri Lanka, there's this port which China might conceivably use, but I doubt. I think where military applications for this project are the greatest will be in Pakistan. That is, China is building a lot of facilities in the port of Gwadar, the overland, oil pipelines. So these things will enable China to maintain its access to Middle East oil in the case of a military conflict with the US or with India. So that is, but overall, I think Belt and Road is a very poorly conceived, ambitious project for which Chinese leaders now have a lot of regrets, despite the fact that they keep talking about them.
Thanks very much, Minchin. And finally, a question for Chris, which comes from Michael Tang, who asks, how will talents play a role in big power competition? The US has benefited a lot, he says, from highly skilled immigration, but the Trump administration has driven away many foreign students to other nations. Will the Biden administration try and be able to woo back those foreign students, especially in STEM fields? That issue of people-to-people engagement and student exchanges, Chris, is a fundamental element of this, isn't it?
So I won't speak to the policy dimension directly, but I think it's fair to say that part of the reason the United States has prospered so significantly is by attracting the best and the brightest. And in a globalized world, this is something that all countries that are looking to propel themselves forward have done effectively. And I think if we are to do this effectively, we too have to be prepared to have the sort of exchanges, the sort of engagement, certainly with young people, that will help both them and us be a more competitive and open system.
Terrific. You got me right in on time as well. Thank you very much, Chris. I want to thank all of you. I hope we've managed to tread a bit of new ground here. I know it's there's many more fascinating panels to come. I deeply appreciate you all being here. Eric Eggleman, Fiona Hill, Min-Shin Pei, Christopher Walker, thanks so much for your time today. And I am going to hand it back to our MC, host, organizer, and impresario, David Kramer, with thanks to him for convening us all of here today.
Simon, and thanks very much to you for superb moderating, and thanks to all four panelists. You had 3 hard acts to follow from the panels earlier today, and I'll tell you, you lived up to it. So thanks very, very much for this. Grateful for you taking the time, and it's wonderful to see all of you. We are going to take a short break, 15 minutes, and then we will be back with Senator Ben Cardin at 3 p.m. Eastern time. So thanks again.
Thanks very much, Simon. See you.
Thanks, folks. Thanks, Chris. All the best.
Yep, take care. Bye.
Thanks, Simon.
Terrific.
Thanks,
Thank
Eric.
you, guys.
Thanks so much.
The environment the students are facing today is unlike ever before.
It's all about team-based work in the 21st century of careers.
Being able to do teamwork and compromise on their positions and play the role of different sectors, the public, the private, the nonprofit sector, with different strategic priorities, and being able to combine them all and superpose them into an initiative that truly adds value to all the organizations and the actors involved.
The way that we communicate has changed.
More and more we're bringing in professionals who have a skill set that combines with the academic expertise of other faculty members that really make a difference.
I want to be able to remove the fourth wall between the classroom and the world around us.
The different experiences that the faculty in the Masters has were fundamental to really understand what I needed and to gain these different points of view to become a better professional.
One of the most important dimensions, and it's really the crowning achievement of the program, is the capstones.
Capstones, for me, as somebody who comes to this work in international affairs as a practitioner, I think is one of the best parts of the program.
The value of what they did in the classroom is manifest in this particular capstone project.
It allows them to take everything that they've learned in our program up until that moment and practically apply it.
It allowed me to develop and create innovative solutions for the corporation I work with.
It was an opportunity to understand how corporations really integrate corporate responsibility into business operations.
Students are working directly with the policymaker.
Really prepare me with the tools and skills needed to succeed at my former position at Citigroup as a problem manager for Latin America, and currently here at Rockwell Collins as the senior specialist in gold trade compliance.
If they want to pursue studies or careers in international affairs of one sort or another, whether in the government or in the private sector or in the think tank world or in academia, the FIU's MAGA program, the Green School's MAGA program, really is a terrific way to get started.
To the person that is considering the Masters of Global Affairs here at FIU, I recommend it because it is a program that is tailored to the needs of the global market